All right, we'll go ahead and get started. I know we might still have some more folks joining us, but I want to be respectful of your time if you're already here and logged in. Again, would love to know just a little bit about where you're at in your med school application process so that I can kind of reference that and be the most helpful that I can throughout our time together this evening. So, as we get started, I just wanted to first take a couple of minutes to introduce myself. So, my name is Krysta. I use she, her pronouns. I've been working in higher ed for a little over a decade and have been coaching students through the med school process for about the last 5 years. So, this is my full time gig. I do this professionally at a large university here in the Midwest and have been coaching on Leland since about August of 2024. Was named one of the top 50 coaches for this past year, which was really exciting and a great surprise, but honestly, mostly because of the students that I work with and their incredible accomplishments. So excited to be here with all of you today to hopefully start your journey as you're getting ready to apply to medical school. My focus is always really on helping students to tailor their application package to really demonstrate their skill sets in a meaningful way, to tell their stories. And so I'm excited to talk a little bit more about that process and what you all can expect from the med school application process this evening. So, our agenda for the evening is as follows. We're first going to talk a little bit about how you select programs, right? What are the factors that you should consider? How do we think about those? We're then going to talk a little bit about the components of the application. As you may or may not know, the med school application process is pretty time intensive, pretty financially intensive, and there are a lot of moving pieces. So we're going to break it down so that you've really got a checklist to be able to work through in terms of what you should be working on over the next year or so. And then we'll talk about that timeline, right? So, yes, the whole process can take a little over a year, actually, especially if we're starting to prep now and then looking to apply this cycle and then start school in 2026. It's a long process, but I am here to help you through it. So, if there are questions as we're chatting this evening, please feel free to drop those in the chat. Would love to get to them and answer them as we're going. We're here together for about the next hour or so. So we can also do a little bit of Q&A at the end and get a little bit more into some conversation there. So as I mentioned, we're going to go ahead and start off with program selection. And so as we're thinking about our guidelines for selecting med schools, the first thing that I always caution folks to think about is to not choose too many programs to apply to. I know that with med school, especially, there's this mentality of, I just want to get in wherever they will take me. But it's important for you to also consider, right, where are you going to be happy for the next 4 to potentially 10 years of your life, right? That's a really long time commitment. It's a huge financial commitment. And so we really want to make sure that we're limiting our school list. So at most, I recommend that folks apply to about 20 schools. The other things I want you to take into consideration as you're thinking about this and why this 20 number is so important is that there's going to be an application fee for each program. There would be a secondary fee for each program. And then there's also going to be secondary essays for each of those programs, right? So think about, right, do you want to spend your whole summer writing essays? The answer is probably not. And so because of that, we really want to try to limit our list to the 20 schools that we're most excited about. If you need a little bit of flex room in there, if you do want to apply to a little bit more, I'm going to say 25 to 30 is really as high as I would say you should go. Again, thinking about the fact that there's going to be additional fees for each of the programs, that there's going to be additional essays, we really want to make sure that we're being good stewards of our resources. So for those of you who are just joining us, you joined at a great time. We're just kind of getting into the very beginning of the presentation, talking a little bit about guidelines for selecting med school programs. So moral of the story, we're trying to limit ourselves to about 20-ish schools that we're applying to. As we're thinking about that list of 20, we want to think about the geographic consideration, right? So do I want to stay in state or in the region, right, to be close to my support system? I know with some of the students that I work with, being close to family, being close to friends is something that's really high up on the priority list for them. And so really making sure, right, that if you want to stay in the Midwest, that we're not applying to schools in California, right? But then on the flip side of that, right, if there's somewhere in the country that you've always wanted to live, med school is a great opportunity to spread your wings and try something new. So really think about what's most important to you, right? And that's going to be different for everybody. There are no right or wrong answers here. But think about, do I want to be close to my support system, or am I okay with taking a little bit of a leap and trying something new? Similarly, we want to consider our alignment with the program, right? So if there are specific pieces we're really looking to gain from our med school experience, right? Maybe we really want to work with underserved populations, and there's a program that has a great street medicine organization that you want to be a part of to really serve the unhoused population in a large city, right? We want to take that into consideration as we're thinking about program alignment. Or if you really want to make sure that you're going to have access to amazing research opportunities, right? Really taking that into consideration as you're selecting programs, right? And not limiting yourself by just applying broadly when we know, right, that that alignment piece is going to be really important so that you're getting what you want out of your med school experience. So some of those other specifics are considering program values, right? So when the program talks about what's important to them, what's on that list, again, thinking about the populations that they serve, the research opportunities that they have available, right? We're looking for that alignment with your values as well, right? So finding programs that align with your values. We also want to consider our research and clinical interests. So I've mentioned the research piece already, but think about, what do their placement rates look like for specific specialty areas that you're interested in, right? Or what types of clinical rotations do they offer, and do those align with your career goals? These are all things that we want to take into consideration as we're sort of selecting those 20-ish schools that we're putting on our list. And then finally, if there's some specific faculty that you're really interested in working with, right? If there are folks whose maybe like research papers you've read, or faculty that you've interacted with during your time in undergrad or at conferences, right? We want to take that into consideration as we're making our program selections as well. This faculty consideration piece can also be a large part of how we select whether we want to apply to colleges of human medicine, so MD programs, or colleges of osteopathic medicine, so those DO programs. Faculty who are more concentrated in the osteopathic medicine arena, right, are looking a lot more at that holistic care piece, probably working on osteopathic manipulative medicine, so OMM. So thinking about if those are things that interest you, right, we definitely want to talk more about DO programs. I will say by and large, I do see a lot of students apply to both MD and DO programs just to kind of give themselves a little bit more of a range to explore their options. But if you feel really strongly about one or the other, that's definitely something we can chat about too. So moving on, I want to get a little bit into the application components. So thinking about what are the types of documents essentially, right, that you're going to need to assemble for your med school application package. So I wanted to frame our conversation around these competencies. So this list of competencies comes from the American Association of Medical Colleges, so the AAMC. This is the organization that facilitates the MD school application, so the AMCAS application. And so they've come up with this list of competencies that they look for in incoming med students. Our colleges of osteopathic medicine, so the ACOMAS application, those DO schools, they have also adopted this list of competencies. And the reason that I always bring this up when we talk about applications is essentially this is a job description, right? This is a school saying these are all of the traits or all of the competencies that we look for when we're evaluating applications, right? I was at Oakland University's White Coat ceremony earlier, well, I guess late last year now, since it's officially 2025. And they talked about how they use this in their application process and that they weren't comparing applicants to one another. They were looking at applicants to see how many of these competencies they could see reflected in their application. So my strategy when working with applicants has really been to have them draw parallels between their own experiences and the competencies you see here on this list throughout their application, right? So there's 17, 18 components here. And so certainly we're not going to fit all of those into a personal statement, but maybe we pick 3 or 4 to focus on in your personal statement, and we tell a story about those 3 or 4 that really helps to demonstrate it, right? That shows the committee that you have those competencies. And then maybe some of the other ones we touch on in your activity sections, right? Perhaps we talk about your critical thinking skills that you developed in the research lab. Or maybe we talk about your service orientation from volunteering at the refugee center. Perhaps we talk about your understanding of human behavior and living systems that you were really able to invest in as a tutor for other students on your campus, right? So we would really frame your our activity section around these competencies. And then these competencies are also a great starting place for your folks who are writing your letters of recommendation. As somebody who writes a lot of letters, I know it's really helpful to have students tell me a little bit about what they're hoping I'll touch on. And so being able to go to them and, say, I think that I really developed my interpersonal skills, my quantitative reasoning, and my resilience while working with you in the research lab. Would those be things that you'd be willing to comment on in your letter? So again, I want y'all to be thinking about these AAMC competencies kind of as we're going into each of these components. We want to make sure that those are included. So where do those competencies come from, right? They're going to come from our experiences. And again, we're just really trying to highlight how we can demonstrate that we have those competencies through these types of experiences, right? So the main experiences that we'll be reflecting on as we put together your application include your clinical experiences, right? So anything that you did to work with patients, where you were working in a medical environment. This can encompass everything from shadowing to working as a scribe, to working as a medical assistant, right? Any of those spaces in which you are really working with patients, you're surrounded by doctors or PAs, folks whose careers you want to emulate, right? Those are going to be the clinical experiences we're talking about here. For volunteer experiences, my advice is always really to think about, if you're still working on curating some of your volunteer experiences, I'd suggest that this be the part of the application that you use to kind of like develop a personality for your application, right? To develop a unique point of view. So our volunteering is anything that kind of helps us to live out our purpose or live out our specific interests in serving others. So I have a lot of folks who are really interested or passionate about women's reproductive health. And so maybe their volunteer experience takes place at Planned Parenthood. Or maybe they're really enthusiastic, right, about wanting to provide better access to healthcare, particularly for marginalized populations. And so they volunteer at the Refugee Development Center, right? So really do some reflection to think about how your volunteer experience can add that unique point of view to your application. We want to touch on leadership roles. So any of the student organizations that you've been a part of, whether they were science-based or not, right? If you were the, let's say, to go really out there, right, the captain of your Quidditch team. I know that that sounds a little bit silly, right? But you were probably organizing practices. You might have even been communicating with folks from other schools to set up matches. You might have been providing like constructive guidance and coaching to other folks on the team, right? So again, even though it seems like a little bit of a far out thing to mention in a med school application, one, it's going to make you really memorable. And two, it's going to allow you to talk about some of those more durable skills, right? So you might have heard these talked about as soft skills in the past. I like durable skills because it's a reminder that we kind of use them no matter where we go. So communication, teamwork, our ability to think critically, right? Those are kind of those durable skills that we're talking about, and those can show up in our leadership opportunities. Research, pretty self-explanatory, right? But please don't undersell the importance of a class research project, especially if you had a semester in a course where you identified a research question and designed an experiment and had to execute it and analyze the data and present it to your peers. That absolutely counts, for lack of a better term, as research experience, right? You're working through the scientific process. You're having to think critically about your results, about how you're going to present those results. So that counts as research experience, in addition to any of the research you might have done in an internship or in an on-campus position with a faculty member. So lots of different options for that sort of research bucket. And then last but not least, something I want you to be reflecting on are your personal experiences, right? Many of us are motivated to go into medicine because of a close connection to medicine personally. And so while this shouldn't be the entire basis of your essay, especially because those situations can be tough and traumatic, and I don't want to exploit your trauma to help you get into medical school, they can be really effective ways to kind of lead into where your interest in medicine came from, right? Perhaps they're an anecdote that we share in the very beginning. So do spend a little bit of time thinking about what those might be. All right. So we're going to talk first about the personal statement in terms of like larger components of the application. This is certainly the topic area that I get the most questions about, and certainly where I spend the bulk of my time coaching students throughout the med school application process. So the prompt for your med school application is going to be pretty simple. It's why do you want to be a physician, right? That's kind of the question we're trying to answer. But we're going to answer it through a series of stories, right? Saying things like, I like science and I want to help people just doesn't give a committee enough of an understanding, really, of what our motivations are, what our purpose is in pursuing medicine, right? Hopefully, fingers crossed, everybody who's applying to medical school likes science and wants to help people, right? I really, really hope that that's the case. Otherwise, we've got some bigger problems on the table. So we want to spend some time thinking about in your personal statement, what is that unique story that we can tell about you? We'll get into that here in just a couple of minutes. Wanted to touch on briefly sort of the logistics of this. And so the character limit for your personal statement for both the AMCAS, so the MD application, and the ACOMAS, so the DO application, is going to be 5,300 characters. So we can track that in Google Docs. We can track it in a Word doc, obviously. Usually this is like 2-ish and change pages, depending on your spacing. And so thankfully, that character limit is the same for both essays. What I recommend is that you can typically use most of the same content for both types of schools if you're planning to apply to both. But for your DO schools, we really do want to make sure that we're sharing content that's specific to the DO or osteopathic philosophy, right? Talking about that connection between mind, body, and spirit to really demonstrate that we have a strong commitment. And then last but not least on the slide, in terms of logistics, we want to be thinking about your motivation, your fit, and your vision. We'll talk about what those mean here in a minute. The one thing I want to mention before we move on is that you, for those of you who might be applying to schools in Texas, they have their very own application system for their health professional schools. So it covers their med schools, it covers PA school, dental. I know those are the big three. I think there's a couple more. Their requirements are a little bit different, but since it's just specific to that one state, that's something that if we were working together one-on-one in coaching, we could dive a little bit more into. But this presentation is really built to cover the two large application systems, so the AMCAS and the ACOMAS. All right, so as we think about what we should include in our personal statement, I've got a list of some do's and don'ts that we want to keep in mind. So the first piece is that we do want to make sure that we're answering that prompt, right? So why do you want to become a physician? Which sounds really silly, but sometimes folks will come in with a really specific story that they want to tell that just kind of rehashes maybe a situation that they or someone in their family encountered when it comes to medicine. And it doesn't really get to the heart of why they want to become a physician, right? Other than this really traumatic thing happened to me. But it doesn't give specific stories, doesn't identify a specific angle. And so that's sort of this next piece, right? Is that we want to be able to identify probably 2 to 3 really strong stories that we can tell in your personal statement that demonstrate your skill set, right? And going back to those competencies that we talked about earlier, right? We want to maybe share a specific story about a patient that you worked with during your time as an MA, right? And talking about how you were really able to develop a relationship with them. You developed your interpersonal skills. You developed your ability to think critically when working in a medical setting, right? Those are the types of things we kind of want to convey through those stories. Similarly, maybe there's a paragraph about your research experience and how the first time you ran an experiment that it failed, right? And so you had to learn how to adapt, how to be resilient, how to, again, think critically to overcome challenges, right? Those are all types of skills that we want to touch on within the context of our personal statement. As we're thinking about our personal statements, we want to make sure that we're getting multiple opinions, but I also want you to remember that at the end of the day, this is your personal statement and it needs to sound like you, right? So it can be great to have friends read it, mentors read it, a coach here on Leland. But ultimately, at the end of the day, you want to make sure that you're working with folks who will help you to maintain your voice and make sure that your personal statement still sounds like you. Your personal statement can also be a good place to address any discrepancies in your application. So let's say that maybe you had a semester where you're really struggling with your mental health, right? I think if the last 5 years have taught us anything, it's that anything can happen, and the absurdities of life, none of us are immune from them. And so this can be a great place to address some of those, right? If your grades slipped a little bit due to a family emergency or maybe some personal health struggles, physical or mental, right? This is a great place for us to touch on them just to provide a little bit of more context around it. And then finally, we want to make sure that we're writing well and proofreading. So your personal statement ultimately ends up serving as a really excellent writing sample for the committee to let them see your written communication skills. And so we want to make sure that we're dedicating that time to really proofreading and making sure that it is as clean as it can be. All right, moving on to the don'ts. So, my very first don't is don't speak in cliches or generalities, right? So, going back to that idea of I like science and I want to help people, right? We just want to make sure that you're demonstrating more than that to the committee, right? Because again, if we could take your name off your personal statement and anyone else could turn it in and it would be believable that it happened to them too, right? Because there weren't specifics about a patient or there were no specifics about a research project, right? We start to lose what's unique about you. We start to lose what's personal about you in your personal statement, which is a problem. So again, we want to stay away from those cliches or generalities. The other piece is that I don't want you to feel pressured to talk about traumatic events if you're not ready, right? So, as I mentioned earlier, many of us choose to go into medicine because we had a significant personal experience with it, be that with our own health or maybe the health of a family member. But you don't need to exploit that trauma to get into medical school, right? So, especially if the situation is really traumatic and you wouldn't feel comfortable talking about it with a stranger, I would caution you from putting it in your personal statement, right? Because anything that you put into that statement, anything you put into the application becomes fair game for interviews. And so, in a situation where you're already going to be a little nervous, a little anxious potentially, right, I want to limit the amount of things that might be able to trip you up and make you more nervous. So, again, anything traumatic, we don't need to put in there. And then finally, I don't want you to repeat information from your resume, right? And you're like, well, then where am I going to get the content from? So I want you to listen really specifically to, we want to make sure that you're using your experiences, which you will definitely list on your resume. But we want you to tell stories about them, right? So instead of listing out in your personal statement that in your role as a medical assistant, you took vitals and helped with insurance claims and supported the physicians, and shadowed nursing and PA staff as well, right? Those are all bullet points that belong on your resume. The story about your medical assistant position that belongs in your personal statement is how maybe you worked with an older woman who had come in and was really hesitant about receiving care. Her husband had recently passed away and she really opened up to you about that experience. You were able to form a bond with her, that she would ask for you by name when she came back into the clinic, that you continue to develop your interpersonal skills and notice that like being able to have people open up and tell you stories really affected the way that you connect with patients. And so you've used that ever since, and you would plan to use it in your medical practice as well, right? So see, in this way, your resume should be reserved for kind of those tasky pieces. Your personal statement is going to be more about the impact that you made and the stories that you can share. So I promised we would circle back to motivation, fit, and capacity and vision. And so again, these are sort of like the main areas that we're going to be focusing on when we're telling your stories. So things we might be reflecting on would be what initially inspired you to pursue this path, right? So what were those foundational experiences that you had? But then how has your motivation grown and matured over time, right? So we don't want to just leave it at, well, I got my first doctor's kit when I was 4 years old for Christmas, and I have wanted to be a doctor ever since, right? That can be a cute anecdote, but really I'm going to push you on, okay, so when was it that you noticed that you really enjoyed science, and how did you know that, and what did that look like? How did you then take that information and act on it, right? At what point did you start making active decisions on your own that this was the path that you were going to pursue? So then we're going to talk a little bit about fit and capacity in the personal statement. So how your skills and values align with the profession. So again, this is where those competencies pieces come back in, right? Where we're really demonstrating that we have the skill sets and we know that we have those because of the experiences that we've had that have prepared us for this work, right? So tying in the skills and values and the experiences that we got those from. And then finally, we've got our vision, right? So schools want to know a little bit about where you're headed, right? What areas of medicine do you really want to make an impact in? And not necessarily in a specialty area, right? But what is the larger impact that you want to have on the field of medicine? What are the problems that you want to help to solve? right? Really kind of thinking about that within the vision and being able to touch on that in the conclusion of your personal statement. So, speaking of conclusions and paragraphs, I wanted to give us just a little bit of guidance on essay basics, right? So, I know sometimes, especially as students in the sciences, right, the types of documents we get the most used to producing are lab reports, and your personal statement is not a lab report. So, I want to go a little bit through what those essays should look like. So, your standard essay should contain these three things, right? So, an introduction that really compels the reader to keep reading, body paragraphs that share your stories, and conclusions that kind of wrap everything up. So each of your paragraphs should sort of center around a main theme, right? So a specific story that we can tell within the context of that paragraph. So for med school applications in our personal statements, typically our introduction contains an anecdote or a story about how you became interested in science or medicine. And then we're going to lead into your thesis. So then you're going to kind of highlight what major themes you're going to be covering in your essay. Right. This is the sentence in the paper that says, in this essay, I will talk about, without saying, in this essay, I will talk about. So typically, this is something like my experiences as a medical assistant, an organizational club leader, and a volunteer at, like Holt Elementary School have prepared me by helping me to develop my teamwork, interpersonal, and critical thinking skills, right? And so those would then become kind of maybe the three experiences, three competencies that we're going to touch on over the course of the essay. So then in our body paragraphs, each one of those is going to be dedicated to a specific experience, right? Or a specific skill that you developed. So typically the format that we follow is that you're going to introduce the skill or theme you plan to touch on. You're then going to tell a story about how you learned that skill or embodied that value, right? A patient you worked with, a student you tutored, a research project that you worked on, things like that. And then finally, we're going to end each of those paragraphs by summarizing how you would use that skill in your practice, right? This is a really important piece that a lot of folks miss, especially in their first drafts. They don't tie it back to medicine, right? And so if you can't make the connection between your skill set and medicine, you can't depend on the committee to do that for you. And so we always want to be looping that paragraph back to, here's how I know I would use that skill in my practice of medicine, right? We want to make that very, very clear. And then finally, in our conclusion, we can reiterate our thesis statement, right? Again, touching on why those skills and competencies are so important to our future practice as a physician, and then briefly touch on your long-term vision and goals, right? Be that helping to create more solutions for healthcare access in rural communities, or advocating for continued access to healthcare for LGBTQ individuals, right? Pick your topic, insert it here, right? Talk a little bit about why that's your vision, why that's a goal you want to pursue throughout your career in medicine. So let's go ahead and move on to your activity section. This is going to have a lot of similarities to the personal statement in that, again, we're really trying to highlight like the specific skills and competencies that you've developed in each of your activities. So we'll start with the logistics. So the first piece here I want to touch on is our character limits. So the AMCAS and the ACOMAS are actually very different in terms of what they allow for character limits for those activity sections. So for the AMCAS application, which is again the MD College of Human Med applications, you get 15 entries, so 15 experiences that you get to talk about. For each of those 15 entries, you get 700 characters to write about them. You'll get an additional 1,325 characters for the three that you selected as your most meaningful, right? So these are three experiences that have really helped you to develop your skill set, that have really influenced the way that you want to practice medicine, right? And so I get a lot of questions from folks about, well, are there specific opportunities I should pick as my most meaningful? Are there certain ones that schools want to see are my most meaningful? And the answer is no, right? I want you to pick the things that are genuinely the most meaningful to you, because that's really going to come across in the course of your essay, right? It's going to be really evident what you really care about, just based on how much you're able to share and which skill sets you're able to highlight within the context of your most meaningful. So again, those three most meaningful are part of your 15. So you'll pick out of the 15 you've already put in, you'll pick 3 that are your most meaningful. You'll get an additional 1,325 characters to talk about those. For the ACOMAS application, so for our osteopathic schools, those DO programs, you get an unlimited number of entries. So you can put in as many activities as you want. I caution folks to stay somewhere between 20 and 25 at the absolute most. And you get just 600 characters to talk about each of them, right? So the character limit's a little bit lower, and then we don't get those sections for the most meaningful. So as we're thinking about the content, we'll specifically touch briefly on the tasks that you completed in that role, the skills that you developed, and then how you would apply those in the future. So in these sections, I want you to focus on talking about what you did, but to be brief about it, right? So most med schools are going to know what a medical assistant does. They're going to know what an undergraduate researcher does, right? They're going to have a basic idea of what your responsibilities were. So we don't need to list out all of the vitals that you took on a patient for your medical assistant role, right? We can briefly mention that you took vitals, but then what we really want to explore is the meaning that you're taking away from those experiences, right? So consider like, what are the skill sets that you took away and how are you going to be applying those in the future, right? So really kind of going back, I always have folks kind of chart out their experiences. And so we'll usually create a table, and on the left side, we'll put all of your experiences. And on the right side, we'll start to detail out kind of what you learned from each of them and tie those back to that competencies list we talked about at the beginning of the evening. For your most meaningful section, this is a good place to tell a specific story. We don't want to be repeating from our personal statement. So even if you talk about the same experience, right? Let's say that one of your most meaningful experiences was your volunteer work at the Refugee Development Center, and you talked about a specific student that you worked with there who you were able to build a really interpersonal relationship with, right? Where you got to know them, they got to know you. As a result, you really built up their trust. That influenced your approach to medicine, et cetera, right? If that's this story we tell in your personal statement, we can still talk about the Refugee Development Center in your activity section in the most meaningful, because we could then maybe tell a story about how you worked with the other volunteers or the staff at the Refugee Development Center to develop a program and how that helped you to develop your ability to think critically and to work through logistics, right? So again, we just want to make sure that it's a different story with a different set of skills. And again, I want you to really choose what's important to you. Don't worry about what the schools think, right? If you're enthusiastic about it, that's going to come through in your entry. So a couple of don'ts, as I've said already, don't go into too much detail about your tasks. Schools will have a pretty solid understanding of most of the tasks that are associated with the activities you're going to have. Include experiences that, or don't include experiences that aren't truly impactful. So this is especially where we get into like for the ACOMAS application, where you get an unlimited number of entries. I believe it was Jonathan Van Ness who said, just because you American doesn't mean you should. And so you don't need to list out every volunteer opportunity you've ever had, right? So let's say, for example, that you maybe went to maybe you worked at a soup kitchen once for 2 hours, right? Maybe that's not something that we include. But if we were continuously going back to the same soup kitchen and we were part of the leadership team there, or even that it was a consistent part of our volunteering experience and you built a relationship with folks there, that's something we'll include, right? So really think about how impactful those experiences are as we're including them in their section, in the activity section. And then finally, I don't want you to undersell yourself. Something I hear from pre-med students most often is, well, I haven't really done anything. And then they list off a dozen activities that they've had over the last year. So work with a counselor, work with a coach, somebody who can really help you to make meaning of and fully draw out that list of experiences that you've had. All right. So as we're thinking about the content, the very first piece of your little 600 to 700 character blurb that you're writing should touch on the tasks that you completed, right? That's maybe a sentence. What skills did you develop? So what did you learn? How did you develop your skills, right? So again, kind of getting into, did you develop your communication and teamwork skills as captain of the Quidditch team, right? Talk a little bit about how you did that. And then that last piece, another sentence or so, will be how you would use those skills as a physician or as a med student, right? We, again, want to be circling back to here's the skill, here's how I know I have it, here's how I would use it in the future, right? Because if we can't do that, the committee can't do that for us. All right. So we'll talk a little bit about letters of recommendation next. So as we're thinking about who our letter writers should be, I've come up with a list here that kind of gives us a broad overview. Our number one is science faculty. And so we definitely need at least one letter from a science faculty member who can speak to our academic aptitude in the sciences. And so what I want to caution you against is getting a science faculty letter only from somebody where you were a teaching assistant or somebody who was your PI in a lab. Those are great letters to have, but we do also need somebody from who was a science faculty member who observed you in an academic course, right? Because we want them to be able to touch on how they know you're well suited to succeed in a challenging academic environment. So we want to make sure we have a science faculty member who's seen you in that academic setting, who has graded your stuff in a science class. We then want to have a physician. So this can be an MD or a DO, depending on the type of application. For DO schools, they do want to see a DO letter. They want to hear from somebody who's in that type of practice, that you understand osteopathic medicine, that you understand and want to embody that holistic approach in your work. The next could be supervisors. So anybody who has supervised you in a student employment role, in a research lab, right? So again, this is a great place for PIs, a great place for teaching or folks who have observed you in a teaching assistant role, anybody like that. And then finally, advisors. So if there's an academic or career advisor that you've worked with really closely throughout your college career, that can be a great person to have write a letter as well. I'm going to pause real quick. It looks like Sydney has their hand raised. So Sydney, go ahead and ask your question whenever you're ready.
Hi, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. I just want to say so far the information is super helpful. So I do appreciate this moment right now. My question comes for the physicians portion of the letter writers.
Mhm.
So as you mentioned, of course, if you're interested in applying into a DO school, they would ideally like that physician letter component to be from a DO as well,
Mhm.
right? So I would guess the same would apply for MD. Like say if you're applying to an MD school, they would ideally like a letter from an MD as well, or would they be opposed to, like in addition to that letter, would they be okay with getting a letter from a DO? Or does it
Yeah.
specifically need to be MD?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Sydney. So I would say the specificity typically comes from DO programs, right? Just because I think a lot of students end up writing their application without taking that DO approach into consideration. And so the more evidence we can provide that you've really spent time on learning the DO philosophy, that's only going to enhance your application, right? When it comes to MD schools, yes, I would say ideally we'd have a letter from an MD. I would say they're not as strict about it in my experience anyway, but that ideally we would have a letter from an MD, but that if you had a letter from a DO who could really speak to your experience in a meaningful way as well, and maybe can highlight a little bit of a different skill set than the MD who's writing your letter, then certainly we could submit letters from both.
Okay, thank you. Because currently I work as a medical assistant,
Okay.
and the doctor I work with, he's a DO, and I am interested in the DO pathway, but I didn't know if I want to, because I don't want to limit myself, of course, but I
Yeah,
am leaning towards DO. But of course, as you mentioned, apply to like 20 schools at most kind of thing. Don't kind of, I personally don't want to put myself in a box.
for sure.
So I just didn't know, would it be all the doctors I have relationships with are DO. So
Yeah.
so I just don't know if I need to like kind of try to start building that relationship with the other providers in my clinic that have their MD, so I could accommodate for the letters of recs for the medical schools that are MD focused, or you know what I mean? I don't know if I'm making sense.
Yeah, no, that absolutely makes sense. I think the DOs would be great in terms of being able to touch on your skill set in medicine and to really talk about the relationship that they've developed with you, what the skill sets that they've observed, things like that, even for an MD school. Um, I think potentially spending a little bit of time with an MD, right? Just to check it out, to say that you've seen like that approach to medicine as well. I do think oftentimes, especially in this day and age, that there's more and more crossover, right? That MDs are also really taking that holistic patient care and
Right.
ideas about nutrition and movement and, even principles of OMM like into consideration in their work too. But I would say there are MDs at the clinic that you work in that you could even go in and shadow once or twice, or maybe you can spend a couple of days working with them a little bit more to develop a relationship. It's not a bad idea, especially since we've got some time until the application opens.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much.
You're so welcome. Hopefully that's helpful for other folks too. Thanks for the question, Sydney. So as we think about the logistics of our letters, you can usually have up to 7 letters. Ideally, we want 3 to 5 really strong letters. What I hear from med schools when I chat with them is that really after letter number 4 or 5, they're like, yep, like I've got a pretty good idea of this person's skill set. I don't need to read anymore, right? And so if they do read those last 1 or 2, they're kind of skimming them a little bit more. So I also don't want you to feel pressured to have 7 letters. That's a lot. Most schools are going to be more in that 3 to 5 range, right? So if you had one from a science faculty, one from a physician, and one from a supervisor in one of your student orgs, or a volunteer opportunity, or a student job that you had, a PI, 3 would be totally fine. And then finally, when it comes to content, we want to be thinking about the competencies again, right? So, what are the competencies that you developed with that particular letter writer, and how did you develop them? So, when folks are asking for advice on like, how do I go about saying that to my letter writer, right? This is what I usually tell them. So, usually by this time of year, right, especially if you're headed back to campus here in the next week or so, now is a great time to start getting those like broad commitments for letters if you haven't already, right? So stopping by during office hours or sending an email if it's a faculty member that you've seen fairly recently, right? If it's been 2 years since you've been in their class, I'd encourage you to go in person, see them during office hours, have a little bit of a conversation, right? To make sure that they really do remember you and could write a robust letter in your favor. So that initial ask is just going to be, I'm planning to apply to medical school later this year. I feel like you were a really important part of my journey. I feel like I really developed my skills in critical thinking in your class. Would you be willing to write me a letter of recommendation? Right. And so once we've sort of got that like verbal or written yes, then we can let them know, okay, I'm going to be working on my personal statement here over the next couple of months. I'd be happy to send that to you as well as my resume and any other materials you might need. Like when the time comes. So then typically by March or April, we're looking to get back in touch with those letter writers and send over our early application materials. So this should be a copy of your resume. It's probably at least a draft of your personal statement to give them an idea of what you're going to be touching on. And then in that email, I also usually have my students mention the 2 to 3 competencies they feel like they developed with that person. And so usually we'll say something like, during my time with you, I feel I really developed my skills in A, B, and C, and here's why. I would really appreciate if you could touch on that in your letter of recommendation. But ultimately, I'll defer to your professional expertise. Let me know if you have any questions, right? So this way, we're kind of able to be deferential to the folks who are writing our letters and taking their time to do that. But also, right, kind of giving them some guidance so we can make sure that we're kind of still in control of the narrative around our application. One thing I wanted to mention is in terms of the logistics as well. I do sometimes get questions from folks about like, how do I collect letters? And you're not actually allowed to see them as you're going through the application process. And so something I want you to keep in mind is you do have a couple of options for this. So you can either specifically request the letters through the application system. So through AMCAS or ACOMAS, you'll be able to put in your letter writer's contact information, their name, their email address, and it'll generate an invitation for them to submit that to the system. Alternatively, you could have them upload a letter to your Interfolio account. So Interfolio is a platform that a lot of students use to sort of manage their letters of recommendation so that letter writers only have to submit them to one place. And then AMCAS and ACOMAS have like an agreement with Interfolio where you're able to like import those letters without you seeing them. So they still kind of like abide by the rules and everything. I would say most folks tend to go with just like inserting faculty names and emails or supervisor names and emails, whoever's writing your letter into the system, especially because with med school, right, you only have at most three systems if you were applying MD, DO, and to schools in Texas. Interfolio sometimes comes into play a little bit more when we have folks applying to grad programs. But just so you know, especially if you're letter writers, if you're worried about them submitting more than once, Interfolio can be a really good option for that. Okay, so then let's talk about timeline. So I'm going to try to go through this a little bit quickly. I'm going to get you all a link to this presentation, and then I'll also be able to get you a recording a little bit later this week. The link to the slides I'll get to you over tonight. But I do want to make sure that we have time for questions. So in terms of our timeline, we're kind of here in this spring 2025 semester, although it doesn't really feel like spring. I don't know about y'all. Again, I live in Michigan and it was about 7 degrees here today. We're in the spring 2025 semester. So at this point in time, right, this is really where we're starting to get serious about preparing our personal statements. You might also still be studying for the MCAT. Maybe you have your test coming up. Maybe you've already taken it. Either way is totally fine. We've still got a lot of leeway on that MCAT test time. So during this time period, though, in terms of your application process, we're really focusing in on your personal statement and your activity section. So we're going to see the applications open in the beginning of summer 2025. Typically that first week of May is when we see those open up, right, which is the end of our spring semester usually. And so honestly, you can apply for medical school through December of this year, right? So starting in May all the way through December of 2025. My recommendation is that ideally you'll have your application in by Labor Day weekend, right? So that first weekend in September is honestly the latest I'd like for you to have your application in order to be a competitive applicant. You're going to see a lot of information online, especially on Reddit, about how if you don't get your application in by June, you're not getting into med school. And I can absolutely assure you that that's not true. I've worked with hundreds of applicants over the last 5 years. And I've seen people who have applied the very first day in May and didn't get in at all. And I've seen people who apply in August or September and end up with 5 acceptances and they're choosing between schools, right? So remember that med schools are not looking for the people who apply first. They're looking for the best and strongest applicants, right? So again, I want you to be in by Labor Day, but that still gives us a pretty wide window. And I want you to apply when you're your best applicant, right? So if that means that we have to take an extra week or two to really hash out some of the details in your activities section, and that puts us at applying at the end of June instead of the end of May, that's okay. It's going to be totally fine. I promise you. Something that you'll need to keep in mind is that your process might just look a little bit different than other folks. So again, this can be really flexible. Victoria, I'm going to get to you just right after we finish the timeline, if that's okay. So then we're going to see secondary applications start to go out around July. Again, this is going to be dependent on schools, dependent on when you've applied. But typically we want to get those secondary essays back within 2 weeks of receiving them from schools. And so those can come out at any point throughout the cycle. Again, typically we see those start to go out around July. And usually that's because for the folks who do apply at the end of May, when you can officially hit the submit button, AMCAS and ACOMAS will use the month of June to verify applications and then send them over to schools. And that first transmission doesn't usually happen until the end of June. Over the last year or so, we've seen it happen a little bit sooner, like mid-June, but typically, traditionally, what we see is around end of June, and then secondaries are coming out in July. Interviews can start as early as August, but they can also go as late as March of the following year. So please be patient. Please know that your process might just look different than other people's. And so I don't want you to be patient. I want you to remember that just because you didn't get a call for interviews in September doesn't mean you're not getting one at all. I had a student a couple of years ago who submitted a little bit later. I think it was like mid-August. We had kept in touch. He had graduated. He was working full-time in the Detroit area. And we set up an appointment to talk sometime in November. And he told me he was thinking about applying to a master's program because he hadn't gotten any interviews. And I was like, don't do it. Like, we still have lots of time in the application cycle. Don't do it. And so then we met in December of that year and he was like, I did it. And so he had applied to a master's program, was going to start in January. And then at the beginning of January, got 3 offers for med school interviews. So again, just remember your process might just look different than somebody else's, and that's totally fine. Right? Like getting, whether you get into med school in October or you get into med school in March, you still got into med school. So during that spring 2026 semester is when we're going to see waitlists start to move. So if you have ended up on a waitlist, as folks are making their commitments to one program or another, we'll start to see some of that movement. And then med school will begin in the summer of 2026. So typically June, July, August are when we see those start dates for programs. All right. So we've kind of talked through this piece already, right? Just like when to expect things, right? So in December through February, I want you to be thinking about the schools you want to pick. I want you to start getting in touch with your letter writers and then outlining your statement and your activities. In the spring, we're narrowing down our list of programs. We're sending over that information to our letter writers. We're making edits on our statements. And then in May and June, we're sending those letter writers reminders, finalizing your edits, and then ultimately submitting. So I have some final bits of advice. I will leave those up here for just a minute while we go ahead and take Victoria's question. So Victoria, do you want to go ahead and unmute and ask your question?
Hi, thank you so much. So you kind of answered this, but I just wanted you to elaborate a little bit because I'm most likely not going to take my MCAT till around the end of May, so my scores won't be back to like later June. Would that be okay to still submit my primaries late, or should I just send in the primaries where they don't wait till MCAT scores are received to be able to review applications, or should I just wait to send all of them together?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. So if you're taking the MCAT at the end of May, yep, you'll get your results back about the end of June. Personally, I think then we could just use June to really tighten up the rest of your materials, right? So that you can focus on the MCAT up until that point, right? Perhaps we've got a draft of your personal statement, a draft of your activities, but then we could use June to tighten all that up and then officially go ahead and apply at the end of June once your MCAT scores are in, right? So I would say you're still totally within like a competitive timeline if you're applying at the end of June. The alternative to that I've seen folks do is that they get their application ready before all of that, right? They take their MCAT at the end of May and they submit their application to just one school in the portal to kind of go through that process, right, of having AMCAS and ACOMAS verify your application. And then once we get your MCAT, then we can go back and add additional schools to your application, right? So you pick a school that's a little bit further down on your list. Right? Maybe not your number one pick, just in case your MCAT doesn't go the way that we're hoping that it will. And then we can add the other schools later on. But again, if you're taking it in May, I think it's worth it to just wait to apply until you've got all of your information in. So hopefully that's helpful. You can either, yes, just go ahead and apply at the end of June once everything is in, or you could use one school as sort of your starter for making sure that your application is verified in the systems. And then we can add the other schools after you've got your final MCAT scores.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're so welcome. So I'm also going to put up, as we're wrapping up here, just the link to my coaching page. If you want to set up a free intro call with me so that we can talk a little bit more specifically about your application. And then for coming tonight, I'm also giving everybody a 25% off coupon for your first hourly coaching order with me. So that's good for any number of hours that you want to purchase. But for your first order, you do get 25% off. So there looks like there's a couple more questions in the chat. So the question is, how long do MCAT scores last for? When do they expire? Last I checked, I'm pretty sure it's 3 years that your MCAT scores are good for. But I would just double check the website to be sure about that. Next question, I am taking the MCAT for a second time in May. Can I submit the application in early June with my MCAT score from my first attempt? You absolutely can. I would guess that if you're taking your MCAT for the second time, that maybe it's because the score wasn't quite what we were hoping for on that first attempt. So just kind of keep in mind, do you want the school to see that first score, right? Or do we want to wait until we have the other? again, submitting at the end of July versus, or the early June, sorry, submitting in late June versus early June is not that big of a difference in the grand scheme of things. So if your MCAT score is something that we're really worried about, then I would say we would just go ahead to wait to submit your application. Is there a recording for this? Absolutely, there will be. I'll get the slide deck over to y'all tonight, and then Leland should probably get me the recording here by the end of the week, if not early next week. And I'll make sure that I send that out in a message as well. Question about if I'm taking my MCAT in September, what do I do? So September is a little bit late. I want to say typically, I think September is like your last opportunity. If we're able to bump it up even a little bit to like end of July or early August, that might really help us out. But ultimately, right, if it is September, my recommendation is that we would submit the rest of your applications, the rest of your materials beforehand, just to make sure that they're in the hands of the med schools as you're waiting for those MCAT scores. Again, that'll probably also just really be dependent on what your practice scores are looking like, right, to see if we're close to our goal and what we can expect on test day. Ultimately, my suggestion would be if you can try to push it to even August, I think that that'll help to relieve a lot of your stress in general. But we could definitely talk about that more in a one-on-one coaching meeting if you'd like, Amanda. So Sydney asked, what would the latest day to take the MCAT be? In an ideal world, I'm going to say end of July, early August, right? Because that's going to, again, allow us to get our full application in by Labor Day, which is that first weekend in September. When I talk to med schools, they say, like in general, that's when we really, it's our unofficial cutoff, right? Certainly you can apply through December, but they encourage you, especially just for as long as the process takes, right, to make sure that you're getting your application in by Labor Day. So I would say ideally we're looking at end of July, early August, but I've seen people do it with a September test date too. So it's certainly not impossible. When do you recommend CASPER tests be done? So you can absolutely do those after you've submitted your primaries. You can turn everything else in and then worry about the CASPER. I believe it needs to be completed by December. So anytime after that is fine. The CASPER is really not nearly as intensive as the MCAT, right? It's more of those situational judgment tests that you're going to be faced with to kind of think about like the ethics of medicine and how you handle stressful situations. If you're able to do that, within the month after you submit your primary before you start getting secondary applications, I would say that that's totally fine. Is there an expiration to that or once in a cycle? That's a great question. I think that you can only take it once. I also know that a ton of schools don't. There are not a ton of schools that require it, right? So there are schools that will say that they'll look at it if you have the test score. I think there's a very small handful of schools that are still requiring the CASPER, especially because the AAMC, so again, the organization that facilitates the MD app, they have a test called the Preview that they started pushing out sort of as like a competitor to the CASPER that a lot of the MD schools signed on to use instead. So I would just be really careful about, like checking schools' websites, seeing which ones they accept, like if they'll accept one or the other, or if they require them, or if it's more of just we'll look at it if you have it. Anecdotally, what I hear from med schools is that there seems to be some discrepancy in both of those tools. So they see that like students will do really well in the CASPER, but then do poorly on the Preview. And then vice versa is also true, that they do well on the Preview and then don't do well on the CASPER. So there's just been some question about the validity of like what it actually demonstrates for applicants. I say all of that to say, I wouldn't stress about it too much. If you can complete it within the month after doing your primary, that's probably fine. Awesome. We're coming up on 8 o'clock. So I'll stick around here for just another minute. But again, would love to work with y'all on your applications this cycle. I am offering that discount code. So please feel free to copy and paste that. I'll also include that in the follow-up message that I sent out. Yeah, y'all are so welcome. I'm so glad that it was helpful. So thanks so much for hanging out with me tonight. Awesome. Yeah, Sydney, feel free to go ahead and ask your